Fantastic. I think we've got quite a few people in now, so let's get going. My name is Chloe, and I'm one of the funding officers at the OFS, and I'll be taking us through today's webinar on the submission and verification of your HESES21 workbook. But before we begin, let's go through some housekeeping together. So if I have any Wi-Fi or connectivity problems, my colleague Roger will be here to help me out, and you may see him. We've also will be joined by some other colleagues in the funding team to look after our Q&A. There's lots of opportunities for you to ask questions today. Please use the Q&A box, and we'll be pausing periodically throughout the webinar to answer any questions you may have. Please can you reserve the chat box in case you need to ask a question to the events team. We do have closed captions available today. You can click on the CC icon to access those. And a recording of the session will be available on the OFS website. As it is the last webinar in the series today, we'll be sending out some evaluation and feedback forms to you, to those who have signed up. So we do have this, we do find this feedback really useful for our future sessions, and we really appreciate all the time you take in filling these out for us. But I'll give you a reminder at the end as well. So the other webinars so far have looked at definitions of the HESES21 workbook and how to fill it in. But today's webinar will be looking at the next steps. So how to submit your HESES workbook. This will be looking at how to securely send your workbook to us. How the OFS will carry out your data verification on your HESES return. So this will be looking at what you expect from us and how we work together to finalize the HESES workbook process. And finally, how to get your HESES21 submission signed off. As I said, this is the last webinar, but we have had some others. If you're interested in looking at these, they are available on our events page, and this one will be made available in the next couple of days. We will also have hands-on workbook exercises and breakout groups next week. These are full, but you can always contact us if you're interested, and we'll see if we can fit you in or what we can do to help. We want you to feel as supported as possible throughout the whole process. So along with the recordings, we also publish the slides on the website and any supplementary materials that we use in the webinar or on the workshops. We also recommend that you look at the guide to funding and the guidance documents and the appendices, and these all can be found on our website, www.officeofstudents.org.uk/HESES. I also recommend you have a look at our YouTube videos. There's some really good live demos there which take you step-by-step details, especially on what we're talking about today, and they go through a level of detail which we are not able to do in the webinar. So I definitely recommend those, especially if it's your first time. So moving on to our first section, how to submit your HESES21 workbook. So looking at our timeline, the dates depend on whether you are a further education sixth form college or academy, or you are a higher education provider. So the workbooks, which I'll talk about a bit later, will be available in late October, and you should refer to your census deadline either on this timeline or there's a copy in the guidance letter as well. In the guidance on our website as well, and any communications from us. So from the deadline, the submission deadline, we will be doing any data verification work with you from this deadline up until the end of January 2022. So we do work quite quickly on this, and the timeline is quite tight. So we will be in contact quite quickly, but we also, for more complex queries, may have to take this up until the end of January. So to submit your workbook, we use the portal. The portal basically is a means of securely sending data to the OFS. You can access the portal through the website https extranet.officefordstudents.org.uk/data, it's really important that you use the prefix HTTPS just to make sure the link is as secure as possible. We request that you don't send HESES workbooks by email. This is because we don't want any risk of individual students being identified. We are confident about our email security, but the portal just gives an extra level. But if you do want to send us anything else at all, that's completely fine, and just contact us first and we will tell you the correct way of sending this over. We do have a live demo on using the portal on our website and on our YouTube channel, and in the Appendix 1, downloading and submitting HESES21. If it's your first time accessing the OFS portal, you will need to be a registered user and be assigned to the correct HESES21 area, from which you can download your HESES21 workbook. If you're not registered, you'll need to ask the nominated portal user administrator at your provider to create an account for you and assign you to the relevant survey area. If you don't know who your administrator is, that's no problem. You can view the user administrators at your provider by logging onto the portal or via https://extranet.officefordstudents.org.uk/users. But if you're not a registered user and you don't know who your user administrator is, don't panic. You can contact us on portal@officefordstudents.org.uk and we'll be very happy to help. Once you have access to the OFS portal, you can download the workbook after its release date in October, and you can get going using the guidance and the webinars that we have provided for you. So once you feel comfortable that you've filled in the workbook properly using the guidance in the webinars, we recommend that you complete the self-check questionnaire in our Completing the HESES Workbook document, and make sure that you can answer yes to as many of these questions. If you're struggling with any of these, don't worry, just contact us and we'll be able to help. After this, you need to navigate to the correct area of HESES21 and start the submission process by clicking on the upload button. The upload might take a little time, like a few minutes, but don't worry about this. The web page will automatically refresh and the submission has been completed. Especially during times closer to the deadline, the wait might be a little bit longer. If you need to amend your workbook, so if you submitted it and then you think, oh, actually, I need to have a look again, I need to reflect on this and amend something, you can, that's completely fine. But before the consensus date, upload are permitted, but submissions are not valid. So make sure you re-upload these after the census date. So in between the census date and the submission deadline, you can submit the workbook as many times as you like. If you need to make any amendments, that's completely fine, but we will use the most recently submitted workbook as the one that we use for your data verification process. Please don't unlock or modify your workbooks in any way. These will not be accepted and they may not work in our automatic highlighting. So once you have uploaded your workbook to the portal, check the outcome and comments boxes for errors. If there aren't any, click the results to get the results package zip file. And as I mentioned, workbooks with errors will not be accepted, so just please double check this. The results package is what we will use for the data verification process. So please download this and make sure that it is in a safe and accessible place so you can revisit throughout the whole data verification process, and other people who need to see it, your provider, can do so. Again, we have a live demo for this on our website, and that's also available on our YouTube page. The workbook in the results package is made up of a few things. So it has the submitted data with automatic highlighting, has the information sheet, which I'll talk about in just a second. And the results package of the workbook, as I said, will be used in data verification. So it is important that you keep hold of this. so you can refer back to it. So the information tab is made up of 3 checks. We have the validation check, the first stage credibility check, and the comparison table highlighting in the bottom circle below. We also have information such as the date the workbook was submitted, the submission number, and the deadline in the top left circle, and the version in the top right. So looking at this information tab, we're concentrating on the validation check, which is in red. This is an example of an information tab of a workbook that would not be eligible for submission. You are able to submit it, but we will not accept it. So if you have any red text in the validation check, you have to revisit using the following steps that I will go through now. So if you have any of the validation checks errors come up in red, you will also, along with your results package, have a validation sheet. And validation errors are inconsistencies or errors in the worksheet which shouldn't be there. I'll talk about that more in a second. But these must be resolved before your workbook will be accepted as a valid submission. Otherwise, we will not be able to do our data verification process on it with enough confidence. So here's an example of what a validation error looks like and why an error like this would be flagged up in the information sheet. So the data entered on this workbook is not feasible. So if we look at the example on the right, this example shows that a negative number has been entered in a cell that cannot be negative. This has been highlighted red along with the top of the column and in the text in the bottom or the right-hand side of the workbook. These need to be looked at and changed. And if you have any problems with this, get in touch. Once the validation error has been resolved, the workbook should be resubmitted and a new copy of the result package should be downloaded. The information sheet, when all errors have been resolved, will have green text which says no validation errors. Then you can resubmit and it will be a valid submission. So that's the first section. I'm going to pass on to one of my colleagues now and see if we've had any questions.
Thank you, Chloe. Sorry, my computer appears to be taking a little bit of time to turn the video on. We've had one question, which is just asked about the availability of the HESES workbooks. So Ben's asked us, when will the HESES workbooks be available with submitted data from the HESES21 return in the comparison tables? So you can't make the full HESES workbooks available to you until we've gone past our mini October grant announcement. So we'll be making those available to you at the end of October to download. At that point, you will be able to, they will contain data for your provider if we have it. So you should be able to find them from that point. We've had another couple of questions which have come in while I've been talking. So we've had a question asked from an anonymous attendee who's asked about they want to match their HESES return with their end of year HESES student return. Is there HESES recreation training? I'm not aware that we do recreation training in the same way. So for those of you who aren't aware of that, who are maybe newer to this, you're submitting your HESES return at this point. When you have submitted your HESES return or your ILR return at the very end of the academic year, after the academic year is finished, one of the things that we do, though it's more in our data directorate rather than our particular funding team, they will take your HESES or ILR data and they will use that to recreate the HESES return that you're about to fill in. So it's a way of sort of highlighting where maybe there are some differences between the two, which may be a way of flagging up where the HESES return or the ILR return hasn't been filled in quite the same way, or it may be flagging up real differences that have occurred between now, when you're completing HESES, you may have some elements of forecasting, where you're not perfectly sure about what's happening during the year, and after the end of the year, when hopefully the picture will be much more definite. So I'm not aware that there is specific recreation training. We do provide documentation which talks you through how our algorithms work. So it would describe how we derive things in your HESES recreation. But I will pass on to the relevant team whether it's possible to do something further with that. This wouldn't, obviously, at this point in the year, you're probably more looking at finishing off your recreation and dealing with our questions in the audit team from last year's data, but we may be able to put something in place for next year. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee about some further examples of errors. So if you'll forgive me for a second, I'm just looking at my notes on my other screen. So when we're talking about validation errors, we are talking about data which is not feasible. It's not something that could happen. So this is, the typical example that we've often given is where you've entered a negative number where the workbook requires you to enter a positive number. Or it could be that you've maybe entered an FTE value, which is higher than the student headcount. So you entered an FTE of 150, there's only 100 students relating to that, which is impossible to be entered. That can't happen within the framework of the HESES definitions, because by definition, the maximum FTE is a full-time FTE, which is 1. So it's that sort of thing where it's something which is impossible in the way that we frame things. So it suggests that there's something which maybe just needs changing. So it could be like that idea of making something negative when we're expecting it to be negative, that sort of thing. Next question we have is, why is the release of HESES workbook and deadlines for FEC so tight? I'm afraid this is one of those things that we are hemmed in by certain deadlines. I'm afraid that just means that it becomes very hard to change the deadlines and make things and provide more time. At the very end of the HESES data verification process, we have to set a deadline which allows us to then be able to take the data and process it in time to do our grant announcement. At this end, we are limited by, as I said, when we have HESES data available, when we have ILR data available, and also when we have our own funding data available, with the restrictions of needing to update some providers where they are getting possibly some changes to their grant allocations in October. These might arise from things like amendments to their data, for example. So we want to make sure that what we show in the workbook is as accurate and up to date as possible. And I'm afraid just we could possibly think about moving the deadline for FECs later, but then you start to run into issues with the ILR submission dates. And it becomes, unfortunately, this is the least worst compromise that we've been able to come up with for now. As we move into maybe more, as our funding methods might evolve over the years, we are maybe going to try and look at if there's a way of changing the timelines. I think we're still going to have those same sort of constraints on when we can actually run this sort of process. I don't think we have any further questions at the moment. If you do have any more, please send them in, but I will pass back to Chloe for the second part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Ross. And just to echo what Ross said, we will be pausing again for questions. So moving on to the second part of our webinar, how will the OFS carry out data verification on your HESES return? So the next steps involve you being assigned a data verification specialist. Every provider who submits a HESES return will be assigned one of these. It's the responsibility of the data verification specialist to look at your results package and compile queries using the automatic highlighting that's come up in your results package. Following these, providers may be asked by the data verification specialist to provide additional information or to correct data in response to some of the data that you've submitted. So basically, if some highlighting has come up, we'll just be asking you some underlying causes for that. After the submission deadline, we'll be emailing each provider student data contact, usually within 5 working days. And attached to this email will include a letter with full instructions on the data verification process, data verification queries document listing the specific queries picked up by your data verification specialist, and a deadline for receiving your responses. This is usually 5 working days away from this email. So we expect providers to maintain good and responsible data assurance processes. And we start by looking at your data verification and start by thinking, is this data fit for purpose, by asking you those queries. Following the data verification process, we might also follow with audits, and please note where a provider fails to submit data on time or returns data that's not credible after verification, we may allocate funds based on our own estimates of student activity. And we reserve the right to use our own estimates of data where we believe the provider has provided data that is not fit for purpose. And we also reserve the right to review funding allocations for the most recent 7-year period. So what are we looking for from your HESES data? So your data verification specialist is going to look for the best possible representation of your higher education provision. This allows us to make accurate grant allocations that work best for you. The data verification process allows us to be confident in the accuracy of your data, be confident in the robustness of your data processes, identify any large or expected changes compared to previous years at your provider, and understand the context of your data. So how does HESES relate to what's happening within your provision and it's also as a whole? So what are the data verification queries based on? So this is another information sheet that like one I showed you earlier. However, this is one with no validation errors, and this is quite likely similar to what you will see in your workbook. So we base the queries on 3 checks. So we've got the first stage credibility warnings on the workbook tables. These indicate where data is possible but appears unusual, when I talk about those in the following slides. And we also have the comparison table highlighting. These tables compare your HESES21 data with previous years, and other sources highlight any unexpected changes. And I will talk about those in just a second as well. And we also have any other relevant issues. So, for example, where a provider has merged. So it's not a big issue if you have some orange highlighting here. It's quite typical, in fact. So first stage credibility warnings. This is where data is possible but appears unusual. And it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. It just means that it is just different to what we're expecting using the data that we currently have. So the example on the left shows some orange highlighting has come up on the column section B, new entrants. The error shown has all students recorded as new entrants. So whilst we would expect this at a new provider, this isn't something we would expect at a provider that, or at any other provider. So we would query this in the data verification process just to investigate any underlying causes. The highlighting will also come up below or to the right of the correct worksheet in the workbook. The other check we do is from the comparison tables. Again, highlighting doesn't necessarily mean that you've done anything wrong. It is just different from what we were expecting. In the case of the comparison tables, the highlighting shows fields where comparisons exceed the threshold parameters. We also compare the data that you've given this year to other data sources such as HESA and ILR. Highlighted fields may be queried for the comparison tables. We do not always query all highlighting in the comparison tables, and whenever possible, we will try and compile queries together, as they quite often have the same underlying cause. What can really help with the data verification process is if you provide us with initial explanations. So after reviewing the results pack, you may wish to get in contact with us to explain some of the underlying issues behind some of the highlighting. It's best if we have this before the data verification begins so that we don't have to ask you these queries again. An example of this is the provider has got highlighting in Table 5, Section B. They have an increased proportion of new entrants. The provider data verification contact has got in touch with us saying the reason for this is that the provider has had a recruitment drive in this area. The initial explanations aren't mandatory, but they do definitely speed up the process. And if you would like to give these, please send these as soon as possible to the email dataverification@HESES21.org.uk. There isn't any prescribed format to this, but please make sure that you refer to your results package and make sure that the highlighting we're referring to is as clear as possible. So how do we ask the data verification queries? Your data verification specialist will compile all the queries into a Microsoft Word document. We will exchange this by email between your data verifier and your student data contact, and these will be exchanged back and forth until it's ready for sign-off. We do recommend that you have more than one student data contact to avoid a single point of dependence, just in case of holiday or unexpected leave, especially as the timeline is quite tight. If you'd like to nominate others, please write to us at HESES@officeforstudents.org.uk. Another thing we recommend is that you save workbooks and correspondence where colleagues can access them if required, just in case the nominated student data contact is unavailable. This is an example of the Microsoft Word document you will receive from your data verification specialist. So we have got a query about new entrants on Table 5. We can see this in the second column table row, and it's asking exactly, it's telling us exactly where the query is coming from. And then we have the next column over, which looks at queries. And this is where the data verification specialist has gone into more detail about more information they are requesting from you. And then the final column is where the provider would put in their own information, they put their own answer in. And what you can see from this example is that there's lots of different colors and dates. So there might be a case with a complex query that we do have to ask a few things to make sure the query is signed off officially. So every query is dated and it has a corresponding color. And once the query has been signed off, we will highlight the whole table or the whole row with the query in gray. So likely queries that your data verification specialist is going to ask you are things like, how is your provision changed? Is the query highlighted related to another one? Perhaps we've asked two separate queries, but the reason behind them both is the same answer. Review your responses from previous years if possible, or request responses from your colleagues who have done data verification before, as the answers still may apply. We might ask for changes in the proportion of students by price group, mode of study, or fundability status, and we'll also ask for changes in non-completion rates. What we ask for you is that your responses should directly relate to the query raised, provide an appropriate level of detail, and show an understanding of the HESES definitions. Of course, if you don't understand a query at all, that's no problem. Please get in contact with your data verification specialist and they will help you out. So when returning your responses, please make sure that you've answered all the points in your data verification sheet. In the case that it turns out that the workbook data has to be changed, please contact your data verification specialist who will help you with this. We also have a video about this on our YouTube channel. Please email all your responses to dataverification@officeforstudents.org.uk. This is also the email where we will be sending everything out. Please respond with a deadline. This is usually 5 working days, excluding the holiday period, and please let us know if you have any trouble with this as soon as possible. As I said, it can sometimes take more than one round of queries before the data is ready to sign off. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It just means that we need some more detail. So we're going to pause now again for queries, for questions with Ross.
Thank you, Chloe. We've had one question in from Sophie, who is asking at what point would we be informed if our institution is being audited. So I do recognise that the way we have used audit here, but that can be quite scary. It's not something which you are going to be immediately thrown into as a result of HESES. So I mean, I'd like to answer that. It's not something where we would get to a point where we are looking at your comparison tables and we think, right, we need to audit you there. I mean, where we would be, we as an organisation, where the OFS would be doing audit work with you, is something where the most likely source where you might be interacting with our audit team is probably going back to the point or the question that we had earlier about the HESES recreation. So one of the things that our audit team will do every year is that when they get to the point where they are looking at your HESES data, and there are 350 of you which are in the approved fee cap category who submit HESES each year. We will create HESES recreations for all of you based on your HESES or ILR data, which will highlight the differences between HESES, which we use to fund you, and the recreation, which is the sort of end of year benefit of hindsight picture. And we recognise that there are going to be some differences between those two data sources. What we are looking for is to do further work with, we may ask all of you questions about where those differences have come from. And our audit team will sort of interact with you. Well, I say our audit team lead on the HESES recreation work. So though they are, what I'm saying audits team, it's not that you are being audited at that point. So they would interact with you to ask you questions about the differences between the end of year HESES data and the HESES forecast data that you made at the beginning of the year. And it might just be you might just be asked to sort of, explain that, you had an extra 50 students turn up starting in January compared to what your original forecasts were. There will be some further work that some providers may be asked to do as a result of that, but typically this will only be where providers are showing particularly large differences, either in funding or in student numbers. So where these differences are large enough and significant enough in that they go over a certain threshold, then we might, our data audit team might ask you to do further work with them on that, and as a result of that, they might end up recalculating your funding allocations, which could go up or could go down depending on the result of that audit work. Typically, this is probably only around maybe 20 providers each year. It's not a lot. It's not a large number. One thing I'd point out here is that we do not typically recalculate your funding as a result of your end of year HESES data. So we calculate your funding on HESES. We will look at the recreation at the end of the year, but you do not automatically get your funding recalculated after the year has finished. So if there are some differences, it will not mean that we are suddenly taking money away from you or giving money back to you at that point. So I hope that answers your question, Sophie. If you want to ask further questions about that, please let us know. We have had another question, which I think has just popped up. So an anonymous attendee has asked about HESES cancel years of instances. For full-time, would FTE always be 1 and for part-time 0.5? So if you're recording a student as full-time, if they meet our definition of full-time, yes, their FTE is always 1. For part-time, no, it is not always 0.5. It will depend on how much activity they are doing compared to the full-time course. So in our previous webinar, we talked about how you could calculate this based on the duration of the course. So if they are taking 4 years to do a 2-year course, then yes, it would be 0.5. But if they're taking, say, 6 years to do a 2-year course, then their FTE would be 0.33. So it will depend on the individual patterns of study for those students or those courses. So part-time will not always be 0.5, it can change. Another question, as an alternate provider, will be required to complete a HESES I'm assuming this is HESES return. You spelled it HESE return. Please correct me if I'm wrong. If you are registered with us in the approved fee cap category, we will need you to complete a HESES return. There may be some scenarios where certain providers are able to confirm to us that they have no students at all this year, in which case we may be able to submit a blank return on your behalf, but you are still in effect submitting a HESES return. So if you're registered with us in the approved fee cap category, then you have to complete HESES. If you're registered with the OFS in just the approved category, you do not have to complete HESES, but then you also don't receive our funding allocations as well. That's part of the differences between the two. If you're asking about whether you need to complete a HESES return, then I believe it's the HESES student alternate return is likely to be the one you do, but there are the two different types of return, but we would still look at both sets of data depending on which one you completed. Another question from Gethin. Hello, how long after the release of the reconciliation exercise file will the audit team likely contact the provider where necessary? So when we do the HESES recreation, which happens in the summer, so effectively it's happening now for last year's data, the audit team would contact you about that process, about the recreation process, with their initial questions about those differences between HESES and HESES immediately. If there was any further audit work that was necessary, and I'd like to point out this is only going to be done with a very small number of providers, they would contact you about that. Probably in the process, during the process, they may contact you at that point. It may be shortly afterwards, but it would be you would not be out of contact, and it should not turn up out of the blue. Okay, we haven't got any more questions just at the moment, but I'll give people a chance to submit any final ones. One point that I wanted to raise, not so much as a question, but just as something which is worth mentioning, is that one of the things that we try to do as part of the data verification process is to reduce the burden on you as much as we can. There are still going to be some questions that we will have to ask, and they may be questions that have come up previously, because we need to have that assurance that the data you're submitting and that you're following our procedures, that we have as credible a data as possible. But we will try to reduce that burden where we can. So one of the things that we will do is we will try not to ask you questions on every single bit of highlighting in your workbook. Where these areas of highlighting may relate to the same underlying question, we'll try to reduce the burden by just asking, say, one question which might cover several areas of highlighting. So an example might be particularly relevant to some of the smaller providers where you only offer undergraduate provision. So if you are showing an increase in your overall table, so we can see there's an overall increase in students, and then when we break that down in one of our other tables where we are looking at the split between undergraduate and the different postgraduate levels, we wouldn't necessarily ask a question for that table, because if you only have undergraduate students, then there isn't necessarily any point in asking you the question again, because effectively it's asking the same thing. You've had an increase in students. We're asking about, there's no point in asking about an increase in undergraduate students because you only have undergraduate students. So we will try to reduce the burden and minimize the questions as much as we can when we look at your data. I think we've had a question that's just come in. Do students on accelerated degrees still count as one FTE? Yes. Basically, we do not, when we look at HESES, we are not considering accelerated degrees per se. We are looking at whether years of instance recorded are long or not. So accelerated degrees might be long years if they are studying for a longer amount of time during the year. If they meet our definition of a long year, then there is a certain funding stream which gives you a little bit of extra funding to go alongside with that. But they would still be considered one FTE. So they could be one standard length FTE, or they could be one long FTE, but they are still one FTE in HESES. I'm not seeing any further questions coming in. I'll just give it 30 seconds. If you have any further questions after the end of this presentation, please email them to us and we will be happy to get back to you, but I will pass back to Chloe. Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you, Ross. So we're just moving on to the final section of the webinar to talk about how to get your HESES 21 submission signed off. So signing off your HESES21. Once your data verification specialist is content with all the queries that you've answered and you have made any necessary amendments, we'll send off a sign-off form for you. Please make sure that the sign-off form matches the date and the version number of your most recently submitted HESES workbook. You can see this on your information sheet. So if you've only had to submit one time, that's not so much of an issue, but if your data verification specialist has asked you to make an amendment and resubmit, then definitely look out for that. The sign-off forms must be returned by the sign-off deadline. This is the 1st of February 2022. And the sign-off must be signed by the provider's accountable officer. And if this is likely to be, if they're likely to be unavailable, please let us know straight away. So data amendments after sign-off. So as I was saying, your data verification specialist might ask you to make amendments during the data verification process, but after sign-off, amendments are only made in exceptional circumstances. Criteria for any amendments are errors must be widespread and significant, they must relate to clear evidence of a data error, and likely to have a material impact on one or more uses of our data. So we will use the final signed-off version for your data submission, and these will be assessed by a data amendments panel. You can find out more about this on www.office-data-amendment-to-data/. And if you're ever worried about this, after you've had the sign-off form, please get in touch with us straight away. So that concludes today's webinar. We've spoken about how to submit your HESES21 workbook, how the OFS will carry out the data verification on your HESES return, and how to get your HESES21 submission signed off. If you'd like to find out more about any of this, we have our website, www.officestudents.org.uk/HESES. You can email us, and please email us with any questions, and you can email us throughout the whole process. We do want you to feel as supported as possible at HESES@officestudents.org.uk. And we do have our YouTube channel, which is www.youtube.com/office-for-students. So thank you very much for listening. Just a reminder, we will be sending out feedback forms. We really appreciate your time to fill these out for those who have registered for them. And we do try and take as much feedback on board as possible. So this concludes the webinar series. We still have some workshops coming up, and we do have all the guidance. And as I said, any problems at all, please email us. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you very much for coming.